All right. Good morning still, and thank you all for joining us. I hope you had the opportunity to get some coffee. We are having a fantastic conversation on this panel. We're having with us Kristen Siemen, who is the Vice President of Sustainable Workplaces and Chief Sustainability Officer at General Motors. And we're also having David Blatt, who is the founding partner and senior partner at Generation Investment Management. And while you were getting coffee and we were chit-chatting here, I discovered also that there is a huge rivalry that is happening actually on the panel because obviously Kristen is at General Motors and she grew up around, actually in the area around General Motors, so the dream came true to actually work at General Motors. But the thing that I didn't know was that actually David's father worked at Ford before, and he also grew up in the area. So it's fantastic to have true automotive experts when it comes to this panel. And just to jump in the conversation, in the previous conversation, we heard a couple of things that were very, very interesting. Janet mentioned about automobile standards and increasing standards over time and the role of regulation and the role of the IRA moving us forward. And also we discussed about the role of entrepreneurship. Jeremy mentioned about entrepreneurship and venture capital and disruption that is happening across many industries. And of course, one of the industries where disruption is happening, of course, is in electrification of mobility. So it must be a very exciting time to be at General Motors, right? And I wanted to start by establishing some common language for us, maybe, Kristen, and you can help us on that. So carbon neutral by 2040.
Yeah.
What is carbon neutral?
Yeah, so GM, I mean, we've set some pretty bold goals. Actually, Mary Barra set a vision for our company back in 2017 around zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. And we've been marching towards that vision ever since. In 2021, we announced our kind of big, bold goals around being carbon neutral in our products and operations by 2040. And our plan to eliminate tailpipe emissions from new light-duty U.S. vehicles by 2035. So for us, that goal around carbon neutral is really a strong focus within the company, and our partners on everything we can do to decarbonize what we're involved in. And, that's everything from our investments in renewable energy to our work with our suppliers around their products, their operations, and obviously the biggest piece for us is our vehicles. If you look at GM's carbon footprint, 84% of that is the customer usage of our vehicles. So in order for us to get to zero, we have to transition to electric. And so it's an opportunity for us, it's a growth opportunity for the company, and certainly an opportunity to really make that transition and make an impact on the world.
And now thousands of companies have made these public commitments. Tell us a little bit about why did you make that public commitment, right? How voluntary is that public commitment? Is it driven by regulations and incentives and so forth, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, I would say it's something more. Like I said, we've had the vision of, 0, 0, 0, again, zero crashes, zero emissions, zero congestion, since 2017. And then our carbon neutral and aspirations and that were announced in 21. So, we've been on this journey for quite a while. In fact, we've been doing EVs for over 25 years at General Motors. But when you really take a look at what we can do, climate change is urgent, it's real, and the transportation sector is one of the biggest segments that needs to make a change in order to make a difference here. And so for us to be part of that solution, this transition to an all-electric future is our way to really accelerate that path.
And before I go to David, I wanted to ask you also to put in context some of those targets and commitments that companies are making in the context of a time frame. Because Jim started us off showing emission reductions relative to a year. So carbon neutral by 2040, several other components across operations, product use, or supply chain in different years. How, as a very large company that has tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of employees, operations in so many countries. How do you set targets according to those years? Does this have to do with thinking about when customers will respond, what is technically feasible, what policies are made? Give us a sense of that.
Yeah, great question, and I would say it's probably a combination of a lot of things. You know, we are a very technical, engineer-based company. Myself, I'm an engineer by degree. I worked in product development for 27 of my 29 years at GM. And so every goal that we've set has a path and a trajectory to get there. I mean, we do a lot of work and a lot of discussion within the company. I would say in some cases, though we start and we set a goal that's realistic but not quite sure how we're going to achieve that, and in many cases we found that we've been able to go faster than we anticipated. And one example of that is our renewable energy goal. So we set a goal back in 2016, actually, to be 100% renewable energy in our operations. In 2016, the goal was 2050. And in 21, we took a look closer at everything we were doing and all of the work and investments we've made. And we said, you know, we can get there by 2035. And then in 22, we took a closer look and you said, you know what, in the US, we can get there by 25. And we were able to announce back in October that we actually have all of the agreements in place to be 100% renewable energy in all of our US operations by 25. And so, you know, when we announced it internally and externally, my favorite comment was from an employee that responded and said, you skipped a generation. You know, so here we set this goal and we didn't quite know how to get there, but the more we worked, the closer it came. And so I think a lot of those goals that are out there, that's our intent, is to just keep working and doing everything we can every day to make the reality happen even faster.
And sometimes you just need to start.
Exactly,
working, right?
exactly.
And then you're actually finding that you can achieve those goals much faster. David, I want to come to you and discuss about net zero commitments and carbon targets from the perspective of investors. So much of the capital markets has become actually a trading infrastructure. There aren't actually as many investors as there used to be that do deep fundamental analysis, understanding industries, understanding companies. At Generation Investment Management, you actually do a bottoms-up fundamental analysis, understanding businesses. I wanted to ask you, how do you analyze companies that are making those commitments? Not from the perspective if they make the commitment or not, but whether they will be able to achieve the commitment or what it takes for that.
Well, it's a great question, George, and good morning, everyone. I think the first thing to start with is that the transition to net zero is really hard. And it takes, I think, a lot of bravery, actually, to do what General Motors has done and a lot of other businesses. And while we will absolutely be putting pressure on companies to do more quickly, I think it's fair to say that it's hard. And it's hard because, number one, it's hard to decarbonize everything, and I'll get to how we think about it here in a second. It's hard to do it in the time frame that we need to do it. And actually, the data that we're utilizing to assess whether companies are becoming net zero is still, frankly, flawed. And we don't have the data as well as we would like. Now, there's a lot of initiatives to improve the data. There's a number of initiatives to improve reporting, which I'll get to. But we just need to put in context that what we're talking about here is very, very challenging. And with that in mind, we start with an assessment of what the business is and what their systems view of how they're operating their business should be or is. And so it ranges from the products that it's producing or the services it's providing to its entire supply chain in the broader ecosystem around the business. And so we're assessing is, number one, are they thinking about it properly? Are they being as holistic as they can be? Is it just scope one, or is it their entire footprint, if you will? And then what we will assess is what are their targets to achieve these objectives. It's not acceptable from our perspective to say, right, we agree that we will be carbon neutral, which is not the same as net zero by 2050, that's to us unacceptable, because unless there is a journey to that, then we're really not going to achieve what we want to achieve from a broader limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees C or better. The other thing to remember, by the way, is related to this is there is a concept in finance at Harvard Business School called time value of money. There is a concept also around time value of carbon. And again, if we're trying to limit global temperature rise 1.5 degrees C, doing it all from 2040 to 2050 is unhelpful because of the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. So carbon reduction today is much more valuable than carbon reduction 5 years from now or 15 years from now. So we're assessing that as well, and when we're thinking about what the businesses are trying to do. Now, ultimately, what we will hold them account to is how ambitious they are relative to their tools, whether they're in fact thinking about it in a holistic way from a company perspective, which means governance, it means strategy, it means reporting and setting targets, and it means risk management. And then what we'll do is we will insist that the reporting is consistent with that. And there's different levels of ambition when you think about net zero commitments or the broader conversation around climate. The least impressive is sort of just saying, all right, we'll disclose our carbon emissions. The most impressive, or the most that we certainly seek, is to agree aggressive, achievable targets based on science-based targets.
Let me drill a little bit deeper into some of those components, and maybe that I will start with Kristen, and then David, I would love to have your perspective as well on that. Because there are when we're thinking about decarbonization and some of those commitments, we're thinking about very different elements. There is an element that is actually upstream in your supply chain, scope 3 upstream. There is an element that is scope 2 from the electricity that you're purchasing and the heating that you're purchasing. There's an element of scope 1, which are your direct emissions, and there's an element of scope 3 downstream. For example, when I am driving a General Motors car, right? And those have very different, actually, attributes to them, but also they differ across a dimension that is very important, which is the degree of control that a company has over those emissions. And as you are moving basically upstream or downstream, that degree of control is getting lower compared to some of your scope 1 emissions, for example, that you directly control over. And something that we repeatedly find in much of the research and the cases that we have written is that companies in general are making much more progress when it comes to scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and they are really struggling many times with the scope 3 emissions. So my question is, how do you overcome some of those challenges, and how do you think about that less control that you have over those emissions, because they might be related to either how customers are behaving or how suppliers are behaving? Maybe, Kristen, can I start from you?
Yeah, no, fantastic question, and I agree. I think our goals that I talked about, we do have science-based targets approved for scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 3 is category 11, which again is our biggest piece that we can have an impact on. If you talk about scope 1 and 2 being easier, I talked about scope 2. We basically have that handled. And really our foundation around scope 1 and 2 started with energy efficiency in our facilities and everything that we can do there. But it's small. Our scale is large because we do have facilities in many, many locations. But scope 1 and 2 total is less than 2% of our footprint. I talked about 84% is customer usage of our vehicles, and we're going to do everything we can there to address it with the transition to electric vehicles, electrification. And then, the grid needs to be decarbonized. Those vehicles need to be charged with green energy for it really to be zero. The next biggest category is our supply chain. And we've talked since day one that we can't make this transition on our own. We need our suppliers to be along with us. We need, public and private sectors to work together. And so what we've done with our supply chain is last year we issued what we call an ESG supplier pledge. So we've asked our suppliers to make their commitments around a carbon neutral goal based on their segment. And then also, because we think the other categories are important as well, also a commitment around a score on EcoVadis, so that, you know, we're monitoring human rights aspects and labor practices, et cetera. And so far, we've had over 70% of our Tier 1 APV, or, you know, purchase volume, have agreed to that and have made their own commitments. And what we're finding, even more impressively, is now our largest suppliers are driving that same expectation through their supply chain. And so to really drive it deep and ultimately get to the point where we're all in line and we all have goals and we can all measure and track and make that progress to zero.
That's super interesting. Let me ask you this. What is the reaction from your suppliers? I'm already overwhelmed with costs and quality. Just leave me alone, go away. Or I'm excited and I want to participate because I see some opportunity or business. Like, what is the reaction, or is it a mix?
Yeah, I mean, I would say much more positive, you know, than any pushback. We actually run a supplier sustainability council that meets every 2 weeks. Some of our top suppliers with our purchasing and supply chain organization, and they were key in developing this pledge. So they helped us, you know, okay, what do we need to ask for? What's going to really be able to move the needle? You know, in reality, many of these technologies and this growth that we're talking about, these are growth and value opportunities for suppliers as well. And so we need to work together to make this transition a reality. And it's good for the company, it's good for the, you know, for the planet. And so together, if we can make those initiatives happen, it's really, I would say it's excitement, it's opportunity. I mean, some of our most traditional suppliers that have maybe been more traditionally focused on ICE are using this as an opportunity, you know, internal combustion engines, to make that transition even within their own companies towards electrification. So it's really been a fantastic partnership on innovation, growth, value, you know, and doing what's good.
So you're not destroying American capitalism anytime soon?
No, not at all.
Just checking.
No.
David, same question to you. How do you think about this issue of control as you are broadening emissions across the value chain and you're thinking about those companies, right? Because there is a real element to this, right? So General Motors can actually start decarbonizing, but to make a battery, you need a lot of electricity. And where that electricity is coming from can make a big difference in the carbon footprint upstream. And then how do you charge a car? If you have an electric vehicle, can also make a difference downstream, right, from customer usage. But obviously, those might be elements that you have less control. How do you think about that?
Well, I think Kristen's answer was terrific. And basically, you have to look at it from a systems view across the entire ecosystem of the business. And she also talked about another point that maybe I can expand on a little bit, which is, when we're talking to businesses and we're deploying capital, we're thinking about the transition to net zero or climate change around what are the risks associated with not transitioning as a business, and that's both from a physical perspective as well as the products and services that you're producing, and then what are the opportunities, and we should probably focus on what are the opportunities. There are the very best net zero transition plans, the very best companies are businesses that are saying, actually, we see that this transformation, not transition, this transformation to net zero will be the most significant economic journey in perhaps history. It's a big deal. Everything we've done today will need to change if we are going to truly decarbonize our economy. And that's not a bad thing. That could be quite a good thing. And so the question is, are businesses embracing these opportunities, and how are we deploying capital against that? The businesses who are making these net zero commitments have embraced that thought, and then it makes it a lot easier then to work with their suppliers, their other stakeholders, including their unions or their employees, to actually galvanize action around the net zero transition. And that's ultimately what we're looking for. If ultimately a business is making a net zero commitment because they think it is what they have to do, then that will be shallow. And that's relatively easy to identify greenwash and to push back on greenwash. The best businesses are as Kristen was saying, what they do is they make what they think are aggressive goals, and then they find out more often than not that they can achieve those goals, and then they ratchet it down, and they engage with their suppliers or their broader supply chain, and that's ultimately what we're trying to assess and also encourage or push.
Kristen, let me ask you a tough question, because I promised to ask
I thought they were going to David.
How much of this is being driven because legacy companies, old companies like General Motors, have been pushed to actually transform versus what David is saying, which is, I see it as a tremendous opportunity for innovation and growth and actually developing better products and services for the customers? Because I guess somebody that might be a little cynical might say, look, legacy companies might not be doing that if it wasn't for disruptors like Tesla, if it wasn't like for regulators that are pushing the field. What is your thinking? Is this from the perspective of the identity of the organization? When you would talk to thousands of engineers, would they say this is an opportunity, or is this a risk to our identity?
I would say 100% an opportunity. I mean, if you think about General Motors' history, I mean, we've been around for well over 100 years, right? And at the core of what we do, it's innovation. And it's engineers that come in every day and want to make their product, their technology better in advance. You know, we were talking backstage beforehand. We've been, dabbling in electric vehicles for over 25 years. We've had huge success stories there. And this really is an opportunity. Once you drive an electric vehicle, you don't want to go back.
I agree.
And so that opportunity for growth and really to transform and the entire industry, as we talked about, is a huge opportunity. I mean, we were very proud to come out and make our announcements and our goals back in 21. One of the things I think that maybe not shocking now, but surprised us a little bit at the time, is the interest we got from new employees. New employees that wanted to come work for a company that not only had technology and innovation at its core, but had doing the right thing at its core. And really, focusing on products and services and methods that were really going to make a difference. And so it's the culture and the passion around that. I mean, last year we actually released a new purpose statement, which we've had our vision and but our purpose statement, and it really took cross-functional group of people within the company to create it. And our purpose statement is that we pioneer the innovations that move and connect people to what matters. And if you think about that pioneering spirit and that innovative spirit that's been in our company, I mean, you talked about the transformation. The auto industry is transforming more, in the next 5 years, really, than it has in the last 100 years. And so to be part of that is a super, opportunity. It's exciting, and, I think the passion in the company's there. So.
David, you spoke a little bit about opportunity, and one of the things that you did, now you're also the chair of the Just Climate Fund that you launched, investing in opportunities across different verticals and sectors of the economy. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about where do you see opportunity perhaps across geographies, but also across different sectors of the economy as well.
Okay. Well, I think maybe, George, if you don't mind, I might just say a little bit about
Please.
why we established that in the first place. And we've been talking about companies innovating and driving to net zero. Mark Carney alluded to, or I guess talked about the significant amount of capital that is available, the businesses or the financial institutions who have made net zero commitments. I think it's also appropriate to say that we in finance are not doing enough quickly enough. We in finance are not really thinking as creatively as some of the businesses are that we're investing in, because we're still stuck in the old way of thinking about capital allocation, which is just risk and return, although that hasn't always been the way that people think about capital allocation. It used to be just return and not thinking people think about risk. And so what we recognized is that we need to help the capital markets expand what they value when deploying capital. And what we really need to understand is the impact of the capital allocation that we're making. And to recognize that we need to do that within a traditional risk and return framework, but recognize that the impact is going to be critical if we really want to make this transformation. So we set up a separate company to Generation to develop an idea around climate-led investing, where we are identifying the industries and the businesses that we think will have the fastest and best impact on making this net zero transition. And oddly enough, these are going to be the businesses that are most carbon intensive and actually hardest. And I agreed with the point earlier that hard to abate can be a misleading statement, but where there is not as much capital flowing into these opportunities. Now, we're doing that because we think it will make a big difference. We think it will, towards making a net zero journey, we think it will help change the way capital is allocated and to develop an asset class around climate-led investing. And also, we think it is a really good way to make money, particularly right now as we're making these journeys. So we think that there are a number of different opportunities, and there are in more traditional ways, whether it be software or lower capital-intensive businesses. But we're really quite keen on the capital-intensive businesses that can and will decarbonize. For example, green steel as one place. The point that I also want to make is, and it was kind of alluded to in the earlier session, what we're talking about right now is the developed markets. We are pretty certain that the United States and Europe and Japan, the developed markets, will decarbonize. We have the technologies, we see pathways, we will decarbonize. The problem is we do not have enough capital going to the developing world. And probably 2/3 to 75% of the capital that we need as a society to decarbonize the industries and economies is in the developing world. So we really do need, and I know there was a question asked at the very end, we really do need to think carefully about how we're going to mobilize capital to the developing world. There are significant opportunities there, and there are significant responsibilities there.
David, when you're thinking about that, how then do you prioritize practically what will make the biggest difference? As you said before, there is a time value of carbon. Reducing 1 ton today is more valuable than reducing it 50 years from now. So when you are thinking about that, what are the types of opportunities that you see that will actually make the biggest difference?
Well, it will be technology transfer. It will be bringing ideas and businesses that work into the developing world, but it will also be mobilizing capital in the multilateral development banks. It will be mobilizing capital for basically the asset owner community will need to get comfortable with allocating capital to these opportunities. And there are indeed amazing entrepreneurs, amazing business ideas in the developing world, and we just have to get used to the notion that we need to prioritize it. But that's, again, not to say that understanding the developed markets and the businesses that work there is a bad idea. We have to do all of that, and there's good reasons to deploy capital. I'm just simply saying that we need to think a little bit differently about how we're doing it, and then recognize that there are opportunities associated with that.
So, Kristen, thinking a little bit about differently applies both in the investment context, but also when you are actually undergoing an organizational transformation. And I can imagine, we actually wrote a case on BMW that we teach here in our basically first year accounting course about its electrification strategy and its decarbonization. And one of the things that the students realize very fast is, to David's point, how complicated this all is. Actually changing supply chain, changing the powertrain, changing engineering, changing operations is actually very, very complicated. So how do you actually implement such a large-scale organizational transformation, and how do you guide not actually 10 people to align, but 100,000 people to align? How do you think about structure, incentives, skills inside the organization?
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, my biggest goal, I think, in my role at the company, first off, it's a huge opportunity to be part of and to work across the company. But my goal is that sustainability is weaved into every aspect of every job, just like safety and quality are at our company. So yes, there's a core organization that's setting some key strategies, and certain functions are responsible for a certain piece or part or goal. But in reality, sustainability is part of everything we do. And so it's how do we ensure that from a design engineer standpoint, that at day one when we're creating a product, we're thinking about the materials we're choosing. Our design office is heavily engaged, our creative design, on choosing materials that are more sustainable and thinking about it from a circular economy aspect. How do we design for recyclability just like we design for manufacturing and we design for serviceability? And to think about how each person has a role, each role has an opportunity. There's a lot of discussions around creating green jobs or training for green jobs. My goal is that we green jobs, and so that we weave the green practices and the ideas and the sustainability thoughts into every job that we're doing, and that's part of curriculums and part of what we do as a company. We talked a little bit earlier about people transitioning into this electrification role, and in reality, an engineer is not trained on a particular part. They don't go to school and learn how to design, an internal combustion engine. That might be one class, but that's not it. Engineering teaches you how to solve problems, how to take complex data and make recommendations and develop a thesis and, ultimately make a recommendation on how to proceed. So that skill set is created over many years. And we talk about innovation, and we have that. We don't need to create a new job for that. Our workforce, even our union partners, they have passion around the product. They build with quality. They build with safety in mind. They may be taking a different part in assembling or working on a different piece of the vehicle now, but it's the same thought process. It's the same skill set, that you don't create overnight. It takes years of training and engagement. So, I've been very lucky. Our sustainability strategy is our corporate strategy. It is part of our business goals. It's not an either or. It's a value opportunity, so it's not a question of is it good for the company. It's absolutely good for the company. Some are very easy to see. Energy efficiency, water efficiency, waste reduction, those are, immediate financial benefits. Some of the others are a little bit, longer in term, but we have a great leadership team that's really engaged and has the passion around, not just today, but what does the future look like?
David, let me ask you now a hard question yourself. So we have 60 seconds. Yes. So we have actually, as part of the Salata Institute, one of the projects of the research clusters is around the net zero commitments. And when you look actually at many of the commitments that companies are making, many of them are actually saying what we hear from Kristen as well, that it's an opportunity, they will have their sustainability report, they will make their targets and so forth. But not actually everybody is making progress. The reality is that not everybody is actually delivering over time on those targets. So my question is, what do you do as an investor if you actually find part of your investees that are actually not making progress? What is your role, and what are the tools that are available to you to actually bring progress?
Well, investing is really two aspects, or two tools, if you will. The first is deploying capital and understanding those businesses, and the second is engagement. And without engagement, often your deployment of capital is flawed. So engagement is going to be critical in these sorts of situations. Now, we have an advantage because we have a very concentrated portfolio, so we don't tend to allocate capital to folks who aren't doing the right thing and haven't figured out that this is an important economic opportunity and risk to manage. But if we did, we would certainly engage with these businesses. The point that we would make, of course, is the risk, the opportunity, the fact that increasingly it's the law of the land or will be the law of the land, so you better figure it out. And, of course, the broader stakeholder community is insisting on it. But it ultimately comes down to understanding what the opportunity and the risks are associated with arguably the most important economic transition in history. And the very best businesses get it. They truly get it. And they know that boards, the executive teams, and investors know that ultimately not addressing these challenges are a dereliction of your fiduciary duty. And so the whole question about woke capitalism, et cetera, for us, we boil it down to, is it a fiduciary duty or not? Yes, understanding climate change and deploying capital against it is a fiduciary duty, and you have to understand how to do that. And that's true for the boards, that's true for the CEO, that's true for the investment community.
So one last question from me before we open up for questions, which is, how optimistic are you now about the future? Because that's where we started from, right? There are reasons for optimism and there are reasons for us to be less optimistic about things. When you actually look at corporate climate commitments, just in their direct emissions, we're talking about hundreds of millions, actually, of tons of CO2. And when we're looking at the value chain emissions that are included in them, we're talking about billions. So it actually could make a difference if companies indeed deliver on those commitments. So, David, I will start with you. Are you feeling optimistic based on the recent developments about the ability of companies to deliver on those commitments?
Well, short answer is absolutely yes. Because I think the alternative of being pessimistic is not a really good idea. It's not a real alternative. So I guess maybe the better answer is I'm determined, or we're determined to drive change. But it is going to be challenging. And the reason why we set up Generation 20 years ago is that we felt business, and by extension investing, had the opportunity to be a force for good. And we completely continue to believe that business and capital allocation can be a force for good. In fact, without business and capital allocation, we're not going to get to net zero and the just transition. But we will need policy. We will need civil society. We will need consumers to be part of this. And I think today, relative to 12 months ago, we are much more optimistic given what's happened with the tragedy in Europe. The Europeans are working much more aggressively to decarbonize their economy. The IRA is a big deal. We think that will stimulate capital. So we feel like we're in a better place. Businesses, entrepreneurs, innovators are developing amazing products and strategies to decarbonize. Big businesses who will absolutely need to be part of this as well are making changes. So there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. There are reasons to be concerned, of course, but our alternative isn't a good one. So we need to be as aggressive as we can, as quickly as we can, because time is of the essence.
Kristen, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, like David, I'm an eternal optimist, but a lot of the points that you made is really where I was, thinking as well. Things like the IRA and the partnership that we've seen there to be able to accelerate this transition, seeing the public sector come together across industries. One of the things I love about this job is how collaborative it is, and that we do work together on challenges and solutions. You mentioned green steel earlier, things like the First Movers Coalition that we've signed on to really help accelerate this transition in some of the very tough areas. And you're seeing public and private come together, I think, like never before. We say it all the time. We have a kind of a motto in GM. It's everybody in. It is going to take everybody to make this transition. The EV is kind of highlighted in that, but it's public, it's private, it's our employees, it's customers, it's local and federal governments to really everything from the infrastructure, utilities, and so we're trying to do our part and play in every one of those that we can to help accelerate, but there's no way we can do it by ourselves. But I'm optimistic that we are all coming together for the common good.
Fantastic. We can open up for questions now. Up there.
Hello, thank you for this panel. I'm Deborah McCoy. I'm a partner at Bain & Company. My question is for David Blood. I found it interesting, this concept you introduced of expanding the way that value is appreciated in portfolio decisions, and then also the time value of carbon. My question is, do you assess that investors or that markets will begin to apply some type of time value of carbon into portfolios given the policy and regulatory pressure toward 2030 and then 2050?
So I think it's a great question, and it kind of goes to George's question: are we optimistic or not? It's going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult. The good news is that there are, as Mark Carney mentioned, I think the number is something in the order of $150 trillion of financial institutions who have made commitments to net zero. Now, we all know that there's double counting there, and we all know that there's quite a bit of greenwash associated with that figure. But the point is that there is a significant commitment to transition to net zero. And so what we're trying to do in terms of providing the infrastructure or the tools is to help the asset owner community as well as the asset management community think a bit differently. In fact, not a bit differently, a lot differently about capital allocation. And so that includes different reporting regimes, that includes different analyses of data, that includes thinking about how your portfolio is aligned to a 1.5 degree C world. There's a lot of work being done on that broader infrastructure. And then more recently, we recognize that in fact, if we don't start expanding how we think about capital allocation to include impact, I'm not saying philanthropy, I'm saying understanding the impact of how we're deploying capital, then we're not going to get there as fast as we need to go. And so developing climate-led investing or impact-oriented investing within the context of risk and return is going to be important. The one thing we haven't talked about, and I just want to throw it out quickly, is that nature is a critical part of this discussion. We've talked about people, we've talked about climate. We need to understand nature. Nature is going to be an important part of how we transition in the developing world. As an aside, there are a number of strategies. I'm sure Secretary Kerry will talk a little bit about this here in a minute. But I think it's fundamentally getting asset managers, finance people to think differently about how we're deploying capital.
Okay.
Thank you. Girish Nadkarni, currently with OGCI Climate Investments. It's good to see billions of dollars poised to invest in energy transition and companies like GM addressing decarbonization. One of the issues which keeps coming up are the various bottlenecks all these efforts come up with, whether it's permitting for renewable energy projects, whether it's access to feedstock for biofuels and sustainable aviation fuel, whether it's access to lithium, whether it's access to rare earth materials, etc. There's a long litany of those things which, no matter how good our intentions are, sort of keep raising their ugly head. So the question for Kristen is, how are you thinking about these issues and addressing them? And for David, as an investor, are you addressing any of these bottleneck issues as well, and how should we generally think about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first off, from a supply chain issue, we can all, I'm sure, give stories of the ways the supply chain has impacted us in the past year or 2 years. We have a phenomenal team that works on our supply chain, and we've had a number of announcements over the past 6-9 months over investments in agreements that we've made around the critical materials we need to produce batteries. In fact, we have all of the agreements in place that we need to meet our plan for over 1 million vehicles and 1 million EVs capacity in 25. And so we're working down that path daily and aggressively. Very focused on having a resilient and sustainable supply chain, so a number of agreements with companies here in North America, and really going deeper into the supply chain than we ever have before. We learned a lot through, the microchip and semiconductor issues that we've had over the past few years, and have really made critical investments all the way from a partnership with Lithium Americas from a mining standpoint and controlled thermal resources out in California for lithium, to working on agreements with around cathode active material, et cetera, so that we're engaged deeper in the supply chain than we were before, and making sure that that continues to be aggressive. And then, I guess from, again, the optimistic view, I think innovation spurs innovation. And when there's a demand that, we have a nation that's based on innovative spirit, and I think we'll continue to see that progress faster than we anticipate.
David, do you want to?
Well, it's a great question. That was a great answer. The only thing I would add to it is, as we think about how we're going to make this net zero transition, we would say, first of all, you have to believe that we can, and we have to take steps to do it. But secondly, we have to address questions like that, which is, we know that there are significant challenges, whether it be natural resource challenges, supply challenges. In the case of the grid, there's significant challenges with the grid. And if we don't understand those challenges and work through innovation to address them, then we're just going to be talking hot air. So it's important to recognize those challenges. But as Kristen said, innovation matters, and what we find time and time again is when an organization commits and begins to truly commit and see what the outcomes of their commitment, they tend to ratchet up their commitments because of innovation and spirit of wanting to get it done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tina Duhame, I'm a neurosurgeon at Mass General and involved with the environment and health. And my question really is a supply chain, very practical question. Our Scope 3 is, of course, like yours, the main bulk of our emissions. We are a heavily plastic-dependent industry, and we're a big sector. So I'm wondering how you're handling plastics, which we're totally dependent on. And the other question, maybe for both of you, is how are you handling investments and pensions and decarbonization of those? Because that always is a contentious issue in my sector.
Yeah, I mean, from a plastic standpoint, certainly an area that, you can look at the vehicle and understand that we're in that space as well. For a long time, we've focused on, recycled content. And so you can go through, many parts on the vehicle, and we can tell you, there were water bottles part of, making that, et cetera. And there's a lot of industries that are, or I should say companies and innovations that are happening in that space as well. Everything from taking general waste and making that, part of the content. But one of the things that we're really focused on, too, is not just how much recycled content you can get into it, but what do you do at the end of life? And sometimes, depending what you put in, makes it difficult to do something at the end of life. So really looking across the board, there's a material called automotive shredded residue, which basically is everything that's left of the vehicle after you take out all the metals. And how do we use that in, future content to be able to really look at it from a total circularity standpoint? The other thing I would say with plastics, it's another area where we're talking cross industries and working with partners in consumer products that we would have never really interfaced with before, but learning that we're all dealing with these same challenges and trying to come up with solutions together, really to drive that scale within the supply base as well, everything from leathers to plastics, et cetera. And so it's, again, there's no answer today, but I can tell you there's a lot of work going on internally in our company and in others to come up with solutions. But I think looking at it from a circularity standpoint is super important.
David, do you want to address the pension question and the investments?
Well, one of the reasons why we set up generation is one, to deploy capital, but secondly, to influence how capitalism evolves. And we believed that the pensions or the asset owner community, whether that be institutional investors or we as individuals, is really a critical, and maybe the critical lever from a finance perspective. So pension funds absolutely need to understand their own carbon footprint, how they've deployed their capital, what is the risk associated with that capital, and then what are the opportunities that they could be deploying capital against. And so the pension community, or all of us as investors, are critical in thinking about how we're going to mobilize this capital. And what we've tried to do over these 20 years is convince the owners of capital that they need to accelerate how they're decarbonizing their portfolios and recognize the risks and the opportunities associated with it. Also, from a particularly a pension holder perspective, it's becoming obvious that if you are a younger person and you are delivered in 20 years' time your pension pot, and the world is at 2.5 degrees C, and we have an unjust world, and nature has been destroyed, that actually is not fulfilling your fiduciary duty from a pension perspective. And so utilizing that thought and getting the owners of this capital, the pensioners, to be part of how they think about engaging with their pension funds is another lever to help us transition to net zero.
One last short right there.
Question for Kristen. You mentioned that you wanted to see jobs greened rather than lost, but an EV has far fewer parts than a nice car, and they're much quicker to assemble. So how can you kind of transition while keeping the jobs that you have? And is there a danger that organized labor actually becomes kind of an impediment to the energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, so first what I said is I want to see jobs greened, not just focused on green jobs, right? But when you ask about the future of work, and it's a big area of focus for us, I talked about the fact that, our engineers may be doing something different today than they are tomorrow. Our union partners are extremely important to us, and you can see with the commitments we've made on the transformation of our facilities here in the U.S. to building EVs, as well as the battery assembly plants. We've now announced, 4 battery cell manufacturing, I should say, here in the U.S., in Spring Hill, Tennessee, Lordstown, Ohio, Lansing, Michigan, and a 4th one to be named. As well as we've made a number of announcements on some of the parts facilities that traditionally were making, internal combustion engine parts for the vehicles that are now transitioning to make electric drive units and things for the EVs. So we are really focused on ensuring that our partners are part of the future as well. And I think the work that we've done continues to show that.
Well, we have heard from both of you a couple of things that I just wanted to summarize, which is, the first one is sometimes you just need to start. And actually you end up finding that what thinks and seems impossible actually becomes every day a little bit more possible. The second one is the idea of positive momentum and how creating positive momentum inside an organization and seeing the positive outcomes that you're creating can really energize people inside an organization. David's point as well that this is a huge opportunity for innovation that we're observing across all sectors of the economy. But that being said, this is not going to be easy. And if it was, we would have done it, right? So I think, but at the same time, this is where business excels, in everything that is actually hard, and that is the basis of sustainable competitive advantage for any businesses, when it is actually hard. So I wanted to thank both of you for joining us today and sharing your insights. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Fantastic job. That's great. That's great.
We will now take a short break.